singing in the desert, and they're always singing, are Yugoslavs, evacuees from the Dalmatian islands and places on the mainland like Split. When Mussolini fell, the Yugoslav army liberated the Dalmatian coastline, but gradually the Nazis beat their forces back, shooting hostages as reprisals. So civilians were evacuated from Dalmatia to Italy, and shortly after, 30,000 of them were shipped across the Mediterranean to Egypt. It was in January 1944 they began to arrive, the beginning of the ham scene season, the season of hot, calm days and sudden sandstorms. The Yugoslavs were not prepared for sandstorms, nor for the barren desert, which was such a contrast to Dalmatia, the blue sea and the green mountains, the vineyards and the fields of maize. But life in Dalmatia under the enemy had schooled them for anything. What was sand after the hangings in the public squares, the night raids on villages, the denunciations and the human vivisections? When you fought in the mountains for months, living on raw frozen potatoes which you can't cook because the fires would give your position away to the enemy, the Sinai Desert is a comparative paradise. Is a young man of 13. 2 years ago, he joined the partisans as a runner. He killed an Italian officer. His father and mother are missing, probably dead. And he himself has been wounded in action 4 times. The Yugoslavs were determined to run their own affairs with as little trouble as possible to other people. The British sergeant cooks, veterans of Alamein, Tobruk and Maris, taught them desert cooking with oil and water. 4 parts oil to 1 of water dripped onto a splash pan. A wartime community. Children and old people, the sick, the wounded, with the able-bodied men and women hundreds of miles away fighting. Now, a year later, what a community these 30,000 people have built up. Independent and self-governing, with their own social services, their own industries and entertainments. From the moment they draw their bulk supplies of food, which, by the way, they get from the British Army as part of the British contribution to UNRRA. The Yugoslavs handle the whole thing. Sinai Desert, as Moses found, is not the most fertile place on earth. But they've made beds in the sand out of tea leaves and cinders. The maize seldom ripens, and the watermelons fall off when they're quarter size. But the important thing is they're green, a bit of Yugoslavia in the middle of the desert. 3, 4, and sometimes even 5 families share the same tent. If they weren't incredibly clean and neat, there'd be all the conditions for a desert slum. As it is, they've made them bright and comfortable with anything they could lay their hands on. Only a few had time to salvage valued possessions like embroidery and national costumes. Even before they arrived in Egypt, a central committee, with its president, had been chosen by the National Committee of Liberation to organize the Yugoslav camp activities. This central committee was responsible for running the internal affairs of the camp. Every day, the president and secretary, accompanied by the interpreter, went over to the camp headquarters, run by UNRRA, the organization which the United Nations have set up to help war victims help themselves. The link with UNRRA HQ in Cairo and the final authority in the camps was the commanding officer, Colonel Becker. He outlined what UNRRA wanted. Of course, there was always the language difficulty, and the committee had their own views on how things should be done. They wanted to do much more than the UNRRA camp authorities could enable them to do, in view of the UNRRA Charter to look after their minimum physical needs, to say nothing of the world shortage of shipping and supplies. But most problems were solved after discussion through the deep mutual respect which they had for one another. There are a number of camps, each with about 5,000 people. In each camp is an UNRRA commandant and a Yugoslav camp committee. The commandant tells the camp committee he wants 50 men to sort scrap next day. All work is voluntary and no one gets paid. If the soldiers in Tito's army aren't paid, they argue, then why take money to help run their own camp? Next morning, the men are on the job. The Central Committee's policy was every fit person should work. But it wasn't as easy as that. The only raw materials they had were salvage, the litter of the battlefields, truck springs, the remains of an aeroplane, rubber tires and worn-out army boots. They had to start from scratch, even making the tools with which to work. A tax on ingenuity, but very valuable experience for the future, for when they went back to a Yugoslavia devastated by 5 years of war. The carpenters started with only a file, a hammer, and one saw, which they cut into 2. Not an easy job. This is their latest triumph, a treadle lathe from scrap, with an old shell case for a chuck. Every skilled man trained a group of apprentices. This work was vocational training for the reconstruction of Yugoslavia. The apprentices demanded to be taught the theory of their craft, as well as the practice. In work there is salvation, they say, freedom through education. Each shop helped the next. The smith made plane blades for the carpenter. The carpenter wooden lasts for the cobbler. The cobblers made practically all the shoes for the Yugoslavs, out of junked army boots, rubber tires, bits of tent canvas, and rope. But during the early months, even the supply of salvage was short. They needed shoes and clothes desperately, but though they scraped along, used every ingenious device, the shops were often idle for lack of supplies. They had the sewing machines, but not the material, not the thread. They were reduced to unpicking balaclava helmets to make sweaters, patching their old clothes with odds and ends. You see, UNRRA's charter is merely to supply essential needs of food, clothing, and medicine. The Yugoslavs in Egypt have not fared badly compared to the people of Europe and Asia. But our post-war responsibilities are enormous, and we shall have to make, in some cases, even bigger sacrifices than we have made during the war. UNRRA authorities in Washington have laid down a basic issue of clothing. Contributions of voluntary societies are additional to the UNRRA issue. As supplies come in, they are distributed. The leader of each block collects for all his people. Here is part of the issue for men of 16 and upwards. It's not complete. The rest is on the way. That is, if it's not been sunk. Very scarce are shoes and greatcoats. Suitable women's clothing is even more difficult to get. There's not enough soap either, though they make their own from wood ash and waste fat. Their clothes are scrupulously clean, what's left of them. UNRRA's biggest job in the camps is health. Each camp deals with sickness in its MI room. They have separate clinics for ear and eye troubles, skin diseases, and minor surgery. The UNRRA doctors work with Yugoslav assistants. So do the UNRRA nurses, giving them training in their spare time. But some Yugoslavs, like Zora Buljan, are already highly trained. Zora's husband was a doctor in Hvar, a Dalmatian island, and when he was killed by the Nazis, she joined Tito's army as a nurse. The central hospital receives all the serious and maternity cases. The health of the camps has been much better than was feared, and the children born now are healthy and normal. It is those born under Nazi occupation who have really suffered. They have no resistance. Yet even they are lucky, because they have good food and proper medical attention. What Nazi occupation means can be seen from this child of 2. The children who have lost their parents get special attention. The Yugoslavs know this problem is going to be even worse after this war than after the last. The fight for freedom has made everybody familiar with death. Up at the cemetery, you find the children, without any adult encouragement, meet together to remember one of their comrades, a boy who has died in the desert, young and far from home. But what bursts out in every way is the spirit of life.
prosijao kroz rešeto i kroz sito. Sahib novi za nas mjesito, drug nam Tito, 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 naše je brašno prosijao kroz rešeto i kroz sito. Pa svjedovi za nas mjesito, drug nam Tito, 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 zaživi.
The camp newspaper came out within 3 days of their arrival. Just an old typewriter, a duplicator, 15,000 sheets of foolscap. Now 1,500 copies are published daily. And everywhere there are the wall newspapers. Drawings, poems, articles, news from home. Anybody can contribute, and nearly everybody does. Schools again started up in a week. No pencils, no paper, no books. So the teachers used their memories, and the children worked with the desert as a notebook. As things improved, they organized an elaborate school system. And as the fishermen, the peasants, and their wives often couldn't read or write, they went to school too. Now they're learning things like bookkeeping, languages, and current affairs. Each camp has its own recreation room. In the new Yugoslavia that has been born out of war, the Serbs, the Croats, Slovenes, Macedonians, and Montenegrins are all equal. That is the decree of the United People's Liberation Front, whose camp president, a veteran of 62, is the oldest fighter in the camp. A united nation with a single purpose.
The Russians are continuing their advance towards Budapest. Marshal Tito has announced the liberation of Belgrade.
Smrt fascismu, sloboda narodu. It means death to fascism, freedom to the people. In that cry is compressed the determination of a people overrun but never conquered. The determination that at the expense of fine lives fighting and the long agony of warfare shall not be in vain. That a new world worthy of the sacrifice of those who have fallen should be built by those who survive.